he ruled an empire that stretched to the ends of the known world. Yet all he wanted was a quiet morning and his thoughts. Tonight, we step into the mind of Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher king, who learned to lead not through conquest, but through calm. So as you listen, let your thoughts rest. You're listening to Boring Biographies for sleep. And before we begin, comment below what time you're listening tonight, your moment of peace, your hour of reflection. Now close your eyes and let's begin the story of the emperor who found strength in stillness. The year was 121 CE. Rome stood at the height of its glory, a city of marble and empire, of triumphal arches and endless ambition. Across its 7 hills, the air shimmered with the clang of blacksmiths, the chanting of priests, the murmur of senators debating the fates of nations. And in a quiet villa just beyond the Tiber, a child was born, Marcus Annius Verus. No one could have known that this small boy, quiet and serious from birth, would one day rule all that the sun touched. To the neighbors, he was simply the son of a respected noble family. To the gods, perhaps, he was something more, a philosopher waiting for his empire. His father died when he was very young, leaving Marcus to be raised by women of uncommon strength. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, and his grandfather, also named Marcus. They were wealthy, but not indulgent. His mother was known for her kindness and her calm restraint. She taught him that gentleness was not weakness, that true nobility was measured not by title, but by the way one treated others. Later in life, he would write in his journal, "From my mother, I learned piety and generosity, and to refrain not only from doing wrong, but from even thinking it." Even as a boy, Marcus seemed old beyond his years. While other children played at war, he sat beneath olive trees, asking questions the tutors could not always answer. He was fascinated by philosophy before he even knew the word for it, by the idea that the world, for all its chaos, might still have order. When he was 12, the Emperor Hadrian visited his family's estate. Hadrian, sharp, cunning, and endlessly curious, noticed the boy's serious eyes and quiet demeanor. He called him Verissimus, the most truthful one. It was meant as a jest, but the name fit, and it followed Marcus for the rest of his life. Soon after, Hadrian appointed a successor, Antoninus Pius, a man of balance, patience, and deep moral discipline. But Hadrian had seen something in the boy. He arranged that Antoninus would adopt Marcus, making him heir to the empire itself. Overnight, the philosopher's son became the future emperor of Rome. And yet, Marcus felt no pride in this destiny, only weight. He was just 17 when he took on the mantle of a prince, but already he carried himself like a monk disguised in royal robes. His studies deepened. He read the words of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who had once been a slave, and found in them a mirror of his own thoughts. From Stoicism, Marcus learned that power was illusion, that suffering was natural, and that virtue, not victory, was the only thing worth pursuing. He began sleeping on a simple bed of boards. He wore rough clothes instead of silk. When others celebrated luxury, he practiced restraint. It wasn't rebellion, it was training, preparation for a life where the mind must remain steady while the world burns around it. Rome, meanwhile, grew louder, richer, and more restless. Gladiators fought in the arenas, merchants shouted in the forums, and senators schemed in marble halls. The empire's borders stretched across 3 continents, and yet, in its center, one boy quietly asked himself, How does one stay good in a world built on conquest? He began writing small notes to himself, reminders, fragments, private teachings. No one would read them for almost 2,000 years. But in those pages, between ink and silence, the boy who watched Rome was already becoming something more, a philosopher preparing to rule an empire and to remain human while doing so. When Emperor Hadrian died in 138 CE, the Roman world held its breath. The empire, vast, golden, and fragile, needed a steady hand, not another conqueror. Hadrian's final act had been one of foresight. He chose Antoninus Pius to succeed him and required that Antoninus adopt 2 heirs, Lucius Verus and Marcus Annius Verus. The boy who once studied philosophy in quiet gardens suddenly found himself at the heart of the Roman world. Antoninus Pius was not a man of war. He preferred laws to swords, wisdom to spectacle. Under his reign, Rome entered one of its most peaceful and prosperous eras. Temples rose, the treasury filled, and the legions rested. He became a model of patience and moderation, and to Marcus, a living example of the philosophy he had only read about in scrolls. The young heir called him father and treated him with reverence. Antoninus, in turn, raised Marcus not as a prince to be flattered, but as a student to be tempered. He gave him tutors who demanded more of his mind than of his manners. He taught him to control his temper, to listen before speaking, and to remember that even an emperor serves something greater: the law, the gods, and the people. Marcus absorbed every lesson. He studied rhetoric with Herodes Atticus, ethics with Junius Rusticus, and logic with Apollonius of Chalcedon. From Rusticus, he received a gift that would change his life: the discourses of Epictetus. Those words, written by a man born a slave, became Marcus's constant companion. They taught him to accept pain, to distrust praise, and to meet every day with reason, not reaction. Later, he would write, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, jealous, and surly, but I will not be carried away by their faults." Even as heir to the empire, Marcus lived simply. He rose before dawn, read by lamplight, and walked through the gardens while the city still slept. He avoided the lavish feasts of the Senate, preferring the company of philosophers to politicians. While other nobles sought statues and estates, Marcus sought stillness, the rarest wealth in Rome. His friendship with Lucius Verus, his adopted brother and co-heir, was one of contrasts. Lucius was charming, impulsive, fond of games and theater. Marcus was quiet, deliberate, drawn to thought rather than pleasure. Yet the two shared mutual respect, and Antoninus ensured they learned to govern together, one through heart, the other through reason. Years passed in quiet preparation. The empire flourished. Marcus married Faustina, Antoninus's daughter, a union of duty that gradually softened into affection. Together, they would have many children, though tragedy would take most of them before their time, a lesson Marcus would later face with stoic calm. As Antoninus aged, the burden of empire slowly shifted onto Marcus's shoulders. He attended Senate sessions, mediated disputes, and handled petitions from distant provinces. He never raised his voice, he never boasted. Those who met him spoke of an aura, not of command, but of composure. He was the embodiment of the Stoic ideal, firm, fair, and inwardly free. In his private writings from this time, he noted a simple truth: waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. When Antoninus Pius finally passed away in 161 CE, Rome mourned as it had not mourned in generations. The Senate erected monuments in his honor and gave him the title Pius, the Dutiful. But perhaps his greatest act of duty was not to Rome, but to Marcus, the student he had shaped into a ruler, the philosopher he had prepared for the storm that was coming. For the peace that had cradled Rome for 40 years was about to break. Beyond the Rhine, the northern tribes stirred. In the east, Parthia's armies moved like shadows, and within the walls of the Golden City, plague and politics were waiting. Marcus Aurelius, now Emperor of Rome, stood at the edge of that calm, a philosopher about to be tested not in thought, but in fire. When Marcus Aurelius ascended the throne in 161 CE, the empire held its breath once more. The Senate approved his succession without resistance, and Rome celebrated the arrival of what it believed would be another golden age. But the philosopher-emperor's first years were anything but peaceful. No sooner had he taken the purple than the Parthian Empire rose in rebellion to the east. Their king, Vologases IV, saw opportunity in Rome's transition of power and struck at Syria. Marcus, guided by prudence rather than pride, sent his co-emperor and brother, Lucius Verus, to lead the campaign. He knew that while Rome adored its generals, it needed its thinkers more. He remained in the capital, governing, rationing, reforming. War, famine, and plague came together like omens. As Lucius marched east, disease followed the army home, spreading through the ports and marketplaces like invisible smoke. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, would become one of the deadliest in Roman history, killing millions, soldiers and civilians alike. Temples filled with offerings, the streets filled with silence. Marcus himself fell ill but survived, scarred not in body but in spirit. He wrote in his private reflections, "Do not hope for a world without disturbance, for such a world would be lifeless. Accept what is given and shape your reason to fit it." He ruled not from the throne, but from the desk, reviewing petitions, overseeing grain distribution, and tending to the machinery of empire as if it were a moral exercise. Each decision, to him, was an opportunity to practice virtue. He forgave debts, protected orphans, and resisted the urge to punish rebellion with cruelty. When the plague emptied cities, he sold his own possessions to fund relief. Gold and silver statues of his household gods were melted into coin, their beauty turned to sustenance. And when Lucius Verus returned from Parthia victorious but weakened, Marcus welcomed him as a brother, though both knew that victory had carried death in its wake. Lucius died soon after, the plague's most famous casualty. The emperor did not weep in public. He wrote instead, "All that happens is just. The universe weaves its pattern, and I am but one thread." Now alone at the helm of the largest empire in the world, Marcus found himself at war once again, not with the East, but with the North. Germanic tribes and Marcomanni crossed the Danube, burning villages and besieging Roman forts. The emperor who once sought wisdom in the gardens of philosophers now lived in tents beside the river, surrounded by the clang of armor and the breath of dying men. Yet even here, amid chaos, he found time to write. Each night, by the dim light of a lamp, he would open his wax tablets and begin to carve thoughts, not for glory, not for history, but for himself. They would later be called meditations, but to him they were reminders that the self must remain unshaken even when the world falls apart. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus's reign would be remembered not for conquest, but for endurance, a test of both empire and emperor. Where others ruled through fear, he ruled through reflection. Where others broke under the weight of circumstance, he accepted the burden as his teacher. And though he commanded legions and governed nations, in the solitude of his thoughts, he remained what he had always been, a student of virtue, trying quietly to live by his own lessons. The northern frontier was cold, wet, and endless, a land of pine, fog, and restless tribes. For a man raised among marble halls, Marcus Aurelius now lived surrounded by mud, tents, and the sounds of soldiers sharpening their blades before dawn. Here, along the Danube, the philosopher became a general, not by choice, but by necessity. The wars against the Marcomanni and Quadi would define the latter half of his reign. They were not wars of conquest, but of defense. Rome, fighting to keep its borders intact, its heart still beating beneath layers of frost. The emperor who once pondered virtue in quiet gardens now spent years in the roar of battle. Yet, in that harsh frontier, his philosophy matured. When others sought comfort, he sought understanding. When others cursed the weather, he reminded them, the cold is not an evil thing. Only the failure to endure it is. Each morning, Marcus rose before the camp. He would walk among his men, sharing their rations, tending to the wounded, listening to their fears. He ruled through presence, not distance. To his soldiers, he was not an emperor wrapped in silk, but a figure in worn armor, a steady gaze behind a lined face. They said his calm steadied them more than the walls of Rome ever could. At night, when the fires dimmed and the winds screamed against the tents, Marcus would sit alone beneath the flicker of a single lamp. There, on wax tablets, he wrote to himself, not orders, not decrees, but reminders. When you wake, remind yourself. You will meet the arrogant, the ungrateful, the deceitful. But remember, they act so from ignorance of good and evil. You, who have seen the light, must not be like them. He never intended those writings for others. They were letters to his own soul, private, raw, sometimes weary. A manual for staying human in a world that rewarded cruelty. As months turned into years, Marcus grew older, thinner, more withdrawn. But the fire within him did not fade. It focused. When he received word of rebellion within the empire, one of his own generals proclaiming himself emperor, Marcus did not rage. He sighed, closed his eyes, and murmured, "Ambition is the shadow that follows power." Then he set out once again, not for vengeance, but for restoration. He marched across snow and mud, past rivers frozen in silence, to meet the usurper Avidius Cassius. By the time Marcus arrived, the rebellion had already collapsed. Cassius was dead, killed by his own men. The emperor wept, not for the traitor, but for the waste of another Roman soul consumed by pride. He ordered no executions, no purges, no vengeance. He said, "Let us not stain our victory with more blood than the gods require." This was Marcus Aurelius, the ruler who fought wars without hatred, who held an empire together not through terror, but through reason. Even his enemies found themselves disarmed by his restraint. One Germanic leader, captured and brought before him, asked why he did not gloat in victory. Marcus replied simply, "Because I am always one decision away from being the defeated." In the years that followed, he continued to balance empire and philosophy, battle and contemplation, command and compassion. And though the world saw him as the last good emperor, he saw himself as something far smaller, a man trying every day to be decent in a world that made decency difficult. The messenger came at dusk, dust-streaked, trembling, his cloak heavy with the scent of sickness. By the time Marcus Aurelius read the report in his campaign tent, he already knew the empire was dying, not from war, but from something unseen. It began in the east. Rumors spoke of fever, of sores that bloomed across the skin, of breath that burned like smoke. Soon, it spread along the roads that once carried Rome's triumph, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, until every city echoed with the same dread. The Antonine Plague had arrived. Marcus returned to Rome to find a capital changed. The marble steps of the temples were littered with incense and desperation. Families whispered prayers to any god who would listen. The smell of myrrh, once sacred, had become the scent of mourning. The physicians could not explain it. Some blamed the air, others the gods. But Marcus did not seek blame. He sought endurance. He organized relief, expanded care in the army camps, directed funds to the poor, and ensured the dead were buried with dignity. Every day, he met with his council, his generals, his healers. They begged him to flee the city, to rule from afar. He refused. "I will not leave my people," he said quietly. "If philosophy means anything, it must mean something when the air itself turns against us." He walked through the streets in simple robes, speaking to the sick, comforting the orphans who huddled near the steps of temples. Some touched his hand and wept. Some cursed him. He bowed to both. At night, he returned to his desk, his candle flickering low, and wrote in his private journal, the one we now know as Meditations. He wrote not as emperor, but as a man who feared forgetting what it meant to be one. Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good. The plague took soldiers, scholars, senators, and slaves alike. Even his co-emperor and adopted brother, Lucius Verus, fell to it. Marcus did not cry in public. He never allowed himself that indulgence. But those who served close to him said that for days after, he would sit by the window before dawn, staring at the horizon where the sun had yet to rise. He wrote, "All is ephemeral. The fame of men, the monuments they build, the breath they take. To remember this is not despair, but freedom." He began to understand the world not as a throne to be held, but as a trust to be honored. Each morning, he would whisper to himself, "The universe is change, life is opinion." And then he would rise to face another day of decay, not with defiance, but with peace. Under his rule, the empire endured, not because the disease vanished, but because he refused to let despair become policy. He taxed himself to pay the army. He sold palace treasures to fund relief. He ordered that no corpse be left unburied, no orphan unfed. When asked how he could remain calm amid so much death, he answered, "Because the task of a man is not to escape life's storms, but to stand firm within them." And so he did. Through plague, rebellion, and exhaustion, Marcus Aurelius remained what few rulers ever were, a man who lived as he thought, who governed by the same laws he asked of himself. He once wrote, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to love, to act. For a man surrounded by death, that was not philosophy. That was survival." Winter came to the Danube frontier like a whisper that turned to iron. The sky was the color of lead, the river frozen in silence. Marcus Aurelius stood among his legions, the same soldiers who had followed him through mud, snow, and plague. and wondered if any man could bear the full weight of empire without being crushed beneath it. He had been emperor for nearly 2 decades. In that time, he had faced rebellion, pestilence, famine, and war, not once, but again and again. And though victory followed him, it did so at a price. His body, once strong and sure, now ached from illness. His eyes, once bright with study, carried the dull fatigue of sleepless years. Yet every morning, he rose before dawn, lit his oil lamp, and wrote. Those writings, meant for no one but himself, became his refuge. On the edge of the known world, he filled page after page with reminders, lessons, questions. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one he was not preaching to others. He was pleading with himself to remain steady when all things bent toward despair. The weight he bore was not only Rome's, it was human. For every decision meant lives gained or lost, cities saved or burned. And while generals measured victory by numbers, Marcus measured it by conscience. Once, when his advisors urged him to punish a group of captured rebels, he refused. He said, "To conquer hatred with hatred is to lose twice." They called it weakness. He called it reason. In private, he grieved. His wife, Faustina, had died years earlier, and with her went the last remnant of warmth from his youth. He loved her fiercely, even when rumor accused her of betrayal. When asked how he could forgive her, he answered, "If one cannot forgive the flaws of those we love, how can one forgive the world?" Each night, the emperor's tent glowed dimly against the northern snow. Inside, the most powerful man in the world sat wrapped in furs, writing with a trembling hand. Outside, soldiers told stories by the fire, stories of the philosopher king who slept on the ground beside them, who ate their rations, who shared their sickness. He could have ruled from marble palaces. Instead, he chose the dirt. And in that choice, Rome endured a little longer. But even stone erodes beneath time. Whispers from Rome reached him, of senators scheming, of his son Commodus growing arrogant and cruel. He had tried to teach the boy virtue, but indulgence came more easily than wisdom. In the privacy of his journal, Marcus confessed his fear. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. I have tried to make his soul bright, yet the dye of the world is strong. Still, he did not despair. He believed that the duty of a man was to act rightly, even when the outcome was beyond control. The Stoics taught that the world unfolds as it must, that pain, loss, and betrayal are not punishments, but reminders. He wrote, "What happens to every man is fitted to him, woven into his destiny. The only misfortune is that which makes us unjust." When dawn came, he stood once more among his men, his armor heavy with frost. They greeted him not with cheers, but with quiet respect, the kind reserved for those who lead by endurance rather than command. He looked toward the horizon, where the fog met the forest, and whispered, "The universe is transformation. Life is opinion. Let me see clearly before the end." That night, the snow began to fall, soft, endless, unjudging, and under that silence, the emperor of Rome closed his eyes for a moment, not as a conqueror, not as a god, but as a man who had spent his life learning how to be one. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, the empire mourned a ruler, but philosophy mourned something rarer, a man who had ruled without being ruled by power. His writings, scattered across wax tablets and papyrus scraps, survived not because he intended them to, but because soldiers and scholars could not bear to see them lost. They called it ta eis heauton, to himself. Today, we know it as Meditations. In those quiet pages, the emperor who commanded armies spoke to no one but his own conscience. There were no decrees, no boasts, no divine invocations, only reminders. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wrote not for immortality, but for discipline. The words were his shield against despair, his compass when storms came from within. Each line is stripped of ornament, pure, almost severe, yet within them lies a gentleness that only experience can teach. To read Meditations is to walk beside a man who carried both the crown and the weight of understanding what it meant to be human. He reminded himself that anger was a choice, not a reflex, that grief was love disguised as memory, that the universe owed him nothing, and that death was not injustice, but completion. In one passage he wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." To the soldiers who served him, Marcus was the calm in the storm. He shared their hardships, walked among their tents, and when fever struck their ranks, he treated it not as a punishment of the gods, but as a part of nature. He forbade cruelty, reminding his commanders that mercy was not weakness, but mastery. And when victory came, he greeted it with the same composure as defeat, knowing both were illusions that vanished with time. After his death, his scrolls passed from scholar to monk, from monastery to empire. Centuries changed languages, but not the weight of his words. Roman generals read them before campaigns. Renaissance thinkers studied them by candlelight. Modern philosophers would later find in his Stoicism the blueprint for emotional endurance in an uncertain world. What made Meditations endure was not wisdom borrowed from the gods. It was honesty born from fatigue. He wrote as a man who had seen the limits of control and still chose kindness. He faced the decay of all he built and still found gratitude. And though his empire would crumble, his words remained, unbroken, unburned, whispering through the centuries. When you arise in the morning, think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. Even now, nearly 2 millennia later, that voice still speaks, softly, steadily, like a candle that refuses to go out. When Marcus Aurelius breathed his last in a military camp on the Danube frontier, ancient sources say Vindobona, Vienna, or Sirmium, the dawn outside was pale and quiet. The soldiers stood in silence, knowing they had lost not only an emperor, but something rarer, a man who had never believed himself divine. There were no grand speeches, no cries to the heavens, only the sound of the Danube wind whispering through the tents. He died as he had lived, calm, disciplined, unafraid. In his final days, he had told his attendants, "Do not mourn me. Return to philosophy. The universe is change. Life is opinion." He met death not as a thief, but as a teacher. For a moment, Rome itself seemed to pause, to hold its breath before the inevitable turning of the world. His body was returned to Rome, carried by soldiers who had followed him through frost and famine, through wars against the Germanic tribes and years of relentless struggle. They lit torches along the roads at night, their flames swaying in rhythm as if guiding the philosopher king home. When his ashes were finally placed in Hadrian's mausoleum, the people wept openly. They had known emperors who ruled with fear, ambition, and spectacle. But Marcus Aurelius had ruled with restraint. And restraint, they realized, is the rarest power of all. But even as the smoke from his funeral pyre faded into the evening sky, the shadow of his greatest mistake began to take form. His only surviving son, Commodus, now wore the imperial purple. Marcus had chosen him out of love, perhaps hoping that virtue could be taught. But philosophy cannot be inherited. Commodus was everything his father was not: impulsive, theatrical, intoxicated by luxury and adoration. He traded the philosopher's scrolls for the gladiator's sword. He renamed months after himself, paraded as Hercules reborn, and filled the Colosseum with blood and applause. To the crowds, he was entertainment incarnate. To the senators, he was chaos in human form. To those who had known Marcus, it was tragedy, not of fate, but of inheritance. The empire Marcus had spent his life preserving, through diplomacy, mercy, and sleepless reason, began to unravel within years. Corruption spread through the marble halls like ivy. The armies grew restless, no longer inspired by duty, but by greed. And though his statues still stood in the forum, the spirit behind them had dimmed. It is said that a few old soldiers who had once marched beside the philosopher emperor still carried his words scratched onto bits of metal, worn thin from handling. When they saw what Rome had become, they would read them aloud, waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. And for a moment, it was as if Marcus still lived, not in palaces or marble, but in memory and discipline. Time, as he had written, consumes all things, but some ideas endure, not because they are shouted, but because they are true. Rome's power would crumble, its gods would fall silent, its borders would fade into dust, yet the quiet stoic wisdom of Marcus Aurelius would outlast them all. For what he built was not an empire of land, but of thought. And even after the empire's ruins had turned to earth, his words remained, steady, luminous, like a candle still burning in the dark. Centuries passed, and the empire Marcus Aurelius once ruled began to crumble like sand beneath the tide. Barbarians marched through its marble gates, senators fled their halls, and the Colosseum, once filled with the roar of crowds, fell to silence. Rome's grandeur faded, its gods forgotten. But the words of one man, written in the solitude of a soldier's tent, survived every ruin. His meditations were never meant for anyone's eyes but his own. They were reminders scratched in wax and parchment, notes to steady the mind amid chaos. Yet as kingdoms rose and fell, those words became a compass for generations searching for meaning in an uncertain world. His writings were preserved in the Greek East by Byzantine scholars and later reached the Latin West, where humanists embraced them. They saw in his Stoicism a quiet echo of faith, a belief that virtue was not granted by the gods, but built by discipline. Waste no time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. That sentence alone became a sermon in its own right, copied by candlelight through centuries of darkness. When the Renaissance dawned, humanists rediscovered Marcus not as an emperor, but as a philosopher of endurance. Painters, poets, and scholars read Meditations and found in them a strange comfort, that wisdom could coexist with weakness, that leadership could be kind without being soft. The Stoic emperor became a mirror for every age that followed, a man who carried the weight of the world and still found space for gentleness. In the Enlightenment, his name returned to Europe like a whisper of reason. Frederick the Great of Prussia kept a copy of Meditations at his bedside. Thomas Jefferson, who would draft America's Declaration of Independence, listed Marcus among his favorite thinkers. And in times of revolution, soldiers carried his words into battle, not as scripture, but as solace. For what greater armor than to remember that pain, loss, and fear were all part of the same design? In the modern world, his teachings live on in the quiet corners of self-reflection, in therapy rooms, in military academies, in the morning routines of entrepreneurs and thinkers. Everywhere people speak of Stoicism as though it were a method, but to Marcus, it was simply a way to remain human in an inhuman world. When life feels heavy, we return to his words like pilgrims to a shrine. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That single sentence has steadied millions. More than 18 centuries after his death, his influence ripples through time, not in monuments, but in moments. In the calm breath before a soldier steadies his hand, in the quiet resolve of someone enduring loss, in the whisper of a person saying, "This too shall pass." Marcus Aurelius may have ruled Rome for 19 years, but his true reign began the day he put pen to parchment and spoke honestly to himself. For in that act, in the refusal to lie to one's own soul, he achieved what no empire ever could, a peace that outlives power. The snows came early that year. The forests beyond the Danube were heavy with frost, and the air itself seemed carved from ice. In that white silence, the legions of Rome stood waiting, their breath clouds of steam, their shields rimmed with frost. And at the center of it all, wrapped not in silk, but in a soldier's cloak, stood Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, emperor, and weary guardian of an empire that seemed to stretch as far as human endurance. He had spent most of his reign fighting wars he never wanted. The northern tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Vandals, had pressed Rome's borders for years. They were not enemies of ambition, but of survival. They fought not for conquest, but for life beyond the frozen rivers. And Marcus, though burdened by illness and grief, understood that. He saw in them not barbarians, but men driven by the same desperation he wrestled with inside himself, the will to preserve what one loves in a world that constantly takes. Each morning, he would rise before dawn. His tent, simple and unadorned, smelled of parchment, ink, and cold air. He would light a small oil lamp, unfold his wax tablets, and write. Not decrees, not commands, but thoughts. Reflections meant for no eyes but his own. Words like prayers, whispered into the quiet. "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be," he wrote. "Be one." It was not philosophy as decoration, it was survival. A way to keep the mind calm while the world burned. The soldiers called him the philosopher in armor. He ate the same food they did, walked the same muddy roads, and refused comfort beyond what they had. When illness swept the camps, fever, coughing, death, he stayed, tending to the wounded, writing beside the dying. He believed that to lead was not to be above suffering, but to share in it. And so, he carried Rome's pain on his shoulders, one burden among many. The Antonine Plague, what historians now believe to be smallpox, had spread from the east years before. It ravaged cities, devoured villages, and left the empire hollowed from within. At its height, it claimed multitudes, perhaps a tenth of the empire, though no one could truly count the dead. Even the temples smelled of incense and death. The people prayed for salvation, but the gods were silent. Marcus did not curse them for it. Instead, he wrote, "Everything that happens is natural. If it seems cruel, remember, nature owes you nothing, yet gives you everything." At night, in his command tent, he would sit beneath flickering candlelight and study the stars, the same constellations he had watched as a boy in the gardens of Rome. To his generals, it was strange. To him, it was necessary. For in the turning of the heavens, he saw a reminder that all things move in cycles, war and peace, pain and calm, rise and fall. Sometimes he would summon his son Commodus, who was still young and untested. The boy would arrive from the safety of Rome, perfumed and polished, and sit before a father whose hands were cracked and blackened by frost. Marcus would speak softly, trying to teach him what power meant. Not indulgence, but restraint. "Remember, my son," he said once, "the throne is not a crown upon the head, but a weight upon the heart." But even then, he could sense the distance between them, the echo between philosophy and youth. Commodus listened, nodded, but did not understand. Outside, the wars continued. Marcus led campaign after campaign, driving back the tribes, forging peace treaties, only to see them break under the strain of hunger and revenge. He saw how fragile victory truly was, how one man's triumph was another man's tragedy, and still he endured. One cold morning, when his generals urged him to rest, he smiled faintly and said, "Rest will come when it is time. Until then, I am what I must be." He turned toward the dawn, pale light spilling over the frozen river, and whispered, almost to himself, "The universe is change. Life is opinion." Those who marched beside him said he never appeared defeated, even in sickness, that his calm unnerved both allies and enemies, that in the eyes of barbarians who had known only chaos, he seemed like a god who needed no temple, a man whose silence was stronger than any army. But within that silence lived fatigue, years of loss, years of holding a trembling world together by thought alone. Each death, each betrayal, each flame of rebellion etched another line into his soul. He had not conquered for glory, only for stability. And in that, he found no joy, only understanding. When spring came and the snows began to melt into rivers, Marcus walked alone along the banks. He stooped, picked up a handful of water, and let it run through his fingers. "Everything flows," he murmured. "Everything returns." A soldier nearby pretended not to hear, unsure whether his emperor was praying or simply remembering. The campaign would continue. But even as he rode back toward the front, the emperor's winter had already begun, not of weather, but of spirit. He had given the empire everything: his youth, his health, his peace. And in return, Rome had given him what it gives all its rulers in the end: solitude. Still, he did not despair. He wrote instead, always writing, always reflecting, as if his words might one day outlast the very empire they were written to protect. And in a way, they did. The war had quieted, but peace never truly came. Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a man carrying ghosts. Behind him lay the frozen rivers of the north, the pyres of his soldiers, and the silence of too many unmarked graves. Before him lay marble halls, applause, and the illusion of triumph. Rome greeted him with festivals, banners, and praise. The Senate called him the savior of the empire. Yet when he looked upon the cheering crowds, he felt only the strange stillness that follows a storm, the kind of calm that hides exhaustion, not victory. He bowed to the Senate, offered sacrifices to the gods, and thanked the people. But that night, when the streets had emptied, he returned to his chamber and wrote simply, "Fame is smoke, wealth is dust. The only true good is the peace within oneself." The years that followed were quieter, but not easier. The empire was vast, too vast, and the plague had hollowed its heart. Cities that once sang with commerce now whispered with hunger. Towns were empty, fields untended. Every message that reached his desk carried news of something lost, a city, a general, a friend. And yet, he remained steady. He met with governors, reformed the law, punished corruption, and rewarded virtue. He walked among the poor, visited the sick, and distributed aid from the palace treasury. He often refused the luxury of gold adornment, choosing instead to wear the same wool cloak he had worn in war. It was not theater, it was belief. He wrote, "A man's worth is no greater than the worth of what he values." But his greatest challenge was not the empire, it was his son. Commodus was now a young man, handsome, strong, and adored by the public. He loved the arena, the cheers, the gold, the thrill of adoration. He was everything his father was not, impulsive where Marcus was measured, restless where Marcus was calm. And though the emperor tried to guide him gently, their bond frayed with time. At night, Marcus would sit alone with his journals and ask himself questions no emperor dared to speak aloud. Have I failed as a father while serving as a ruler? Can one raise a soul when the world demands an empire? He never wrote the answers. He had always believed that reason could conquer chaos, but reason cannot shape another's heart. And as he watched Commodus drift further into the grasp of flatterers and spectacle, he began to see the limits of even a philosopher's will. The plague still lingered, and Marcus's own health weakened. His breathing grew shallow. Fever came and went like a tide. He continued to write, though his hand trembled, reminding himself of the lessons that had guided him since youth. Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good. One winter, as he traveled to inspect the Danube frontier once more, the roads were lined with soldiers and peasants alike. They bowed as his chariot passed, not to an emperor of splendor, but to one of endurance. He nodded to them softly, murmuring, "You bow to a man who will soon bow to time." That night, his aides heard him coughing in his tent. When they entered, they found him writing by lamplight, his tablet resting on his knees. He smiled faintly and said, "It comforts me to put thoughts in order while the body fails." He gestured toward the lamp and whispered, "See how steady the flame remains, not because the wind is still, but because the wick is firm." He closed his eyes then, as if listening to something far away, perhaps the river, perhaps his own heartbeat, and said quietly, "Everything I have learned, I have written down. The rest belongs to time." Outside, the winter wind swept across the tents of the army. Inside, the philosopher-emperor's pen scratched one last time upon the tablet. The end came quietly, as he had always hoped it would. No trumpets, no marble ceremony, just the sound of wind across the Danube and the soft rhythm of soldiers breaking camp in the morning fog. Marcus Aurelius was ill. The physicians had no name for the sickness, perhaps the same plague that had haunted the empire for years, or simply the slow unraveling of a body that had endured too much. He was 58, but looked older, his face drawn, his beard streaked with white, his voice soft but steady. He had returned once more to the northern front, near the city of Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, where Rome's borders trembled against the tribes. Even in sickness, he insisted on being among his men. He slept in the same tents, ate the same bread, and refused the comfort of the general's quarters. To his soldiers, he was not just emperor, but father. One morning, unable to stand, he asked to be lifted to a chair outside his tent. The camp was misted with dew. The horizon glowed faintly with dawn. He looked out over the campfires, thousands of tiny stars against the gray, and smiled faintly. "See how the fires rise and fade," he said to his aide. "So do lives. But the warmth they leave, that endures." His generals gathered, pleading for him to rest, but he only shook his head. "I have rested enough. The soul must do its work while it still commands the body." He summoned his son, Commodus. The young man entered, anxious and impatient. Marcus reached for his hand. "Do not make Rome your servant," he said softly. "Be her guardian. The gods have lent you power. Return it to them in kindness." Commodus nodded, but his eyes were elsewhere, already dreaming of parades, arenas, and applause. Marcus saw it, and for a fleeting moment, sorrow crossed his face, but he let it pass. He had long ago learned that the will of others is beyond the reach of reason. That evening, the camp was silent. Marcus asked for his writing tablets. The words came slowly, his hand trembling, but still sure. "Everything is ephemeral. Fame and the remembered, the rememberer, and the act. Only one thing is worth pursuing, to live and die as a man of virtue." As night deepened, he dismissed his guards and asked to be left alone. When they returned at dawn, the oil lamp was still burning beside him. He was seated upright, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face, as if he had drifted not into death, but into understanding. Outside, the Danube winds carried the sound of morning prayer. The soldiers lit their fires, unaware that their emperor, the philosopher who had taught them that calm is stronger than fear, would never rise again. They buried him with quiet honor. No marble inscription, no gold, only a simple wooden pyre and the murmur of men who had loved him. The flames rose, warm against the cold air, and the smoke drifted east, toward Rome, toward eternity. In his tent, the scribes gathered the last of his writings, the notebooks that would one day be known as meditations. They were not meant for the world. They were notes to himself, reminders of patience, humility, and balance. Yet centuries later, those private thoughts would outlive every monument, every war, every empire. He had written once, long before his end, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." In that he succeeded. He had ruled not by fear, but by reason, not by glory, but by grace. And in the quiet of that northern dawn, the philosopher who wore the purple had finally laid down both crown and burden, leaving behind not just an empire, but an example. The empire carried on, as empires always do, indifferent to the lives that hold them together. But something subtle had shifted. In the ashes of battle, in the quiet of marble halls, the memory of one man endured, not through conquest, but through calm. Marcus Aurelius was never meant to be remembered as a conqueror. He left no triumphal arch, no grand statue towering over the Forum. What he left instead were words, small, steady, handwritten reminders to himself to remain kind when the world was cruel, to stay humble when power whispered otherwise, to find reason even in pain. Those words drifted through centuries, crossing the ruin of empires and the silence of libraries. Soldiers, scholars, poets, and kings all found him again in their own times of unrest. They read his thoughts not as history, but as guidance. Because his lessons were never about Rome. They were about being human, about facing chaos with stillness and finding peace not in what we own, but in how we think. Somewhere along the banks of the Danube, perhaps, the wind still moves through the grass the way it did that final morning. The fires have long since gone out, but the warmth remains. And tonight, as you close your eyes, let his quiet wisdom stay with you. That life is brief, but meaning can be eternal. That we do not control what happens, only how we meet it. And that sometimes the most powerful act is simply to be calm. You've been listening to Channel Name, stories to rest the mind. If you're still awake, tell me what time you're listening tonight. Not as a number, but as a reminder of your moment of stillness. Good night. May your thoughts be light and your soul at peace, like the philosopher who learned how to let go.